Hello, and welcome to the Wade Borth podcast. I'm your host, Wade Borth, and in every episode, my goal is to get you to think differently about how money works and ultimately to empower you to take control of your money and your personal financing system. And I think Tom Wheelwright makes the point that there's like 28 pages that tells you what income is in the modern tax code. And then there's like 28,000 pages that tells you what income is not, right? And basically what that's saying is that if you're willing to understand what those other 28,000 pages are, you can find ways to reduce your income tax. And that's because government wants to influence behavior, like you said in our previous chapter.
Yeah.
Government wants to influence behavior. So they need food, they need shelter. And so they're willing to give quote unquote tax breaks to those that have real estate. Again, how many people are jealous of those people that have real estate, but aren't willing to understand why they made the money that they do? Where's that curiosity to drive them to figure out what they're doing is making them wealthy? So,
Yeah. And I think it goes back to just thinking about how we are educated in this country today, that there is no education around finances and how money works and what people should be doing. And if you just go through the normal education system and don't ever seek new, different information, don't ever pursue, how did that person get real estate? How did they get wealthy by real estate? Then you just assume, well, they got a break, or they, the system's rigged, or their parents had something, and I'm never going to be able to do that.
right. And the other side of the equation is, do you want the government to teach your kids anything about finances? Because again, their whole purpose, if you think about government education, their whole purpose is to take money. Again, we talked about how taxation is theft. Take money, spend money that they don't have, and then create a tax system to take money from you from productivity, right? Take your capital, and then they're going to educate you on, well, here are the breaks, here are the exclusions to that rule. So now you're being kept in bondage by the government, right? Because they're going to create the problem of taxation, and they're going to create the solution.
Yeah. And you're fortunate that the solution is to just give them more money.
Right, exactly. So but to your point is that nobody really has a conversation. That's why a lot of people say, well, why isn't everybody doing this? Well, because it's not taught in schools. It's not, there's nobody here spending billions of dollars in advertising talking about this on a daily basis, right?
Yeah.
So, we don't have 10 channels on my cable talking about IBC or about how you take control of the banking function, because who benefits from that? You do, the individual does. Well, how does that benefit Wall Street? It doesn't, right? They spent millions of dollars to implement legislation to stop you from doing this.
Yeah, I was just thinking, we talked a couple times ago about interest rates, and we've talked a couple of times about how, paying interest on loans, and me wrapping my head around that. And I'm just thinking that in and of itself has been something that has, that the government has been able to condition people to think. So now they're modifying behavior, but with lower interest rates, encouraging people to take on more debt, and now thinking that's normal to just take on debt and you don't have to pay so much in interest. And now we're focused on the interest rate. So that's modification of behavior as well.
Right. And they're getting away from the modern capital, or I would say from the traditional capitalist thought process, right? Which is creating a pool of capital. And then when you create a pool of capital, then you can go start your business or do whatever.
Yeah.
People don't save anything. We've been conditioned to think, because I can't earn any money in my savings, my saving has no value. That's kind of what they're conditioning you to think. Well, if you can understand that creating that pool of capital is going to lead to a tremendous success rate. So that's the idea of capitalism. And then again, the big government does this, and then the banking system, big business has a tendency to like piggyback right on that thought process, right? You have to go to the banks to get your pool of money. If you want to start a business, you have to go to the bank. Why? Why is that like their only solution?
Yeah. He writes in here, capital is a responsibility and should be treated with great respect. There's a lot of power in that sentence.
100% agree. And we've had this discussion many times. You have to love yourself more than you love Wells Fargo.
Right.
But what people actually do with their money And again, if you want to deep dive into that comment I just made, we have a separate podcast that you can grab, right? Go to Sage Wealth Strategy or look on Spotify or wherever you listen to the podcast. Go back to that podcast, because what people do with their money is typically what's important to them. And so you can go back and listen to that in a little bit more in depth, but that's exactly right. Capital you have tremendous responsibility with this most valuable asset that you have.
Mhm.
And it was shared with me a long time ago that those that control the financing always win. Those that control the financing always win. So the question is, why aren't you controlling your financing? Goes back to the golden rule, right? Those that have the gold will rule. Well, we're not being taught how to, we're not being taught that's a real problem. Then we're not being taught how to create our own gold bucket of money. We've been conditioned to believe that it's impossible to do, but is it? People are doing it. And those are the people that are willing to think and work a little bit differently. They're willing to apply, again, this idea behind becoming your own banker takes time, money, and discipline. We all have access to all three of those. Well, some more than others, right? The time equation is probably up on the table, but the money is infinite. You can get as much money as you want if you have the right idea and the right thought process.
Yeah. The only one of those three things that has to dwindle is time dwindles for everybody. That plan doesn't have to dwindle, and the money doesn't have to dwindle.
Right. Yep, it's exactly right. And then the discipline that comes along with it. And the discipline side of it, it goes into a bit of his story about the Chinese, the Japanese business people and the Mexican business people, kind of their thought process is that the discipline of saying it's going to take me some time to build a business that becomes a tremendous cash flow business, right? And so we have to be able to say, well, what's this really going to take? We've been conditioned to think that we need immediate results, but when does that ever really happen? Right.
Mhm.
So, and again, capital has to be managed, and it should be treated with the greatest respect. And I think there's some real power in those words. Like, capital needs to be managed, and it has to be treated with great respect. And I think a lot of people, a lot of business people, especially when times are good, farmers see wheat at, $7, $8 a bushel, $9 a bushel. It's hard for them to get to understand that if they build up capital, that they have to treat it with probably even more respect because they have an opportunity versus when, wheat's down lower, or with real estate, interest rates are at 3 or 4%, but now we're starting to see interest rates rise. People are getting a little bit nervous. Well, this should have been a conversation they were having 4 or 5 years ago, right? But they weren't willing to accept it because they didn't have any pain, because interest is cheap. Again, we've been conditioned to think that interest is cheap, so that's always available, right? And again, in this chapter, he talks about, whatever we do in the financial world is compared to what everybody else is doing. Again, if you can just set yourself aside and just make yourself that just fractionally more efficient, then you're going to win by default, right? So just get out ahead of everybody else. You don't have to be perfect to make this thing happen. So later on in the chapter, I know there's some other stuff that I'll just let you read, because there's some good stories that he kind of trying to relay this message. But the last part of this, he talks about most people, there's a play going on in this world, but they don't understand it. Worse than that, they don't get who the characters are in the play. And I think that is a quote out of Shakespeare, or it's relevant to Shakespeare, that all the world is a stage. The people are the actors thereon. So the people, all the world is a stage, and everybody's an actor. And what you need to do is figure out who those actors are, right? And what role that they play.
Yeah, he goes on to say people just don't play their proper role in the scheme of things. They have, and I've got this underlined, they have abdicated their opportunity, responsibility as it pertains to the banking function in the economy. They've abdicated their opportunity.
Why have they abdicated their opportunity for their responsibility?
I think some people didn't know that they had the opportunity.
Well, yes and no, right? So again, going back to the original premise that Nelson makes, is that you're in two businesses, right?
Yeah.
You're in the business that you do from a 9 to 5 operation in life. and you're in the banking business. People either ignore that to their own peril or they understand it and take control of it. Again, whoever controls the financing in this and anything you do in life typically always wins. So with that being said, you control the banking function, but we want to abdicate this because we can be conditioned to think that only place I can go and get anything is through Wells Fargo. Well, that's the abdication of that responsibility. All we're doing is coming back to you and saying, you have the ability, you have the responsibility of doing that in your own life. You can take control of that if you want. You can become that actor. If you understand you are that actor, and if you choose to be that person or not, that's up to you. But if you want to take control of that banking function, there is a way to get out of that. There's a way for you to take control of that function. I think that's the real point is that, and again, and we do this on a daily basis. We just don't always know it. And so our part of this podcast is for you and I to get people to wake up and say, oh, I can't control that. I want to take control of that.
Mm-hmm.
And then so, and if we don't understand it, we have to understand that by abdicating that responsibility, somebody is doing it for us and they're making a tremendous profit from doing that. Because again, it goes back to the golden rule.
Yep.
They control the gold, so they make the rules. And you can either choose to be part of that or you can choose not to be part of that.
Yeah, he writes in the same where I've got it underlined. He writes, because of the golden rule, those who have the gold make the rules. It can be no other way.
Right. So all we're telling you to do, all we're asking you to think about is how can you create your own gold? And again, it's not going to happen overnight. It's not the lottery. We're not talking about get rich quick. It's about changing our habits, our responsibilities, our, finding discipline to change our lives. Unfortunately, I look at it, one of my founding principles is, I want future generations to profit and to be free, to find that freedom, that control and that freedom that they're looking for. Not just me, but it's my son and everybody else I talk to. I want that to be in the future. I want multiple generations to take control of this. And there are people that do this, quite frankly. It's not like this isn't some secret because people of wealth are already doing this. And that's the kind of crazy part. And again, the jealousy might say, well, yeah, they had money to begin with. Their family had money. Well, how'd their family get money? Right? They didn't start with $1 billion in their checking account. Somebody eventually had to start applying these same principles to their family and then holding their family accountable to the same things that they held themselves accountable and then teaching them for the next generation. That's how these families of generational wealth. And they might say, oh, they stole it. You can have all those things about jealousy, but that's really the devil talking. If you really look at it and say, well, what are you doing? Nicole, what are you doing today to take control of that function in your life? If you're just being mad about it, then if you're going to be mad 2 years from now, 10 years from now.
Yep. Just
So
it just goes back to, do you want to take control of it? Do you want to be the one that makes the decisions, or do you want somebody else to do it? And if you want to do it, then you have to make the decision to do it.
right, and start. Doesn't have to be perfect. You're going to win by default just by even engaging this conversation, just opening your mind up, the possibility that can be done. And then once you start, again, it goes back to once you change that perspective. Again, that little kid in Wimbledon, North Dakota, riding up to my tennis court, I changed my perspective at that time that there's a bigger world around me than I thought. I can't unlearn that. Once you've learned this stuff, you can't unlearn that. And so anything you apply from this whole idea, this whole thought process you're going through, this journey that you're taking, will get you so much further ahead just by opening your mind up to hey, there must be a better way. Well, thank you so much. That was an exciting, 4 pages that we went through.
Yeah.
Or maybe 5, whatever it was. But we have
It's kind of interesting to me that Nelson took the time to really talk about the human condition, because if you don't understand its basic concepts, then all the rest of this doesn't really it can make sense, but it loses some of its power because you're not thinking about human condition and how we as individuals have come to look at some of this process of taking control of the banking function of your life.
Yeah, I would agree. You have to, again, everybody wants to jump to the solution. But until you understand what the disease is, you understand what the problem is, it goes back to probably a previous podcast you and I talked about. If you go in the doctor and he's already prescribing, again, amputation and antibiotics, and you're like, hey, wait a second, I don't know what the problem is. And then he tells you that, you have gangrene, you're going to die unless you lose that foot or whatever it is, right? If somebody comes in and all they want to do is talk about the solution, but we're not willing to understand what the condition is first, then typically the solution is not palatable.
Right.
Even though as much as I understand it, you understand it, and maybe they instinctively know what the problem is, they still want to understand what the ultimate problem is. And in this situation, what we're talking about, this banking function in our lives, the ultimate problem starts with us, right? Is what we're focusing on, where we're going, what we've been conditioned to think. And until we can address that, the solution doesn't make any difference. And then all these other things can creep into that. That's really, these ideas that really aren't true can creep into that. But if we understand what the problem is, then that never becomes a problem down the road. So we have to start with, like Nelson was smart. He said, we have to understand what the human problem is first. Until we can whip Parkinson's law, until we can understand, the golden rule and Willie Sutton's law. Once we understand all that, then the problem becomes self-evident.
Yeah. Well, and then you can also identify when those things are creeping into your decision making.
Yeah, because they creep in every day. You just have to fight it every day. And again, you don't have to be perfect. You just have to understand it and then move forward with that understanding. And it's going to get you ahead of the competition, which is everybody else. So,
yeah.
That's a great point. Thanks for bringing that back up. That's a great way to cap this off.
Very good. Well, this couple of chapters to go through. I guess the next ones we have are the arrival syndrome and use it.
Yeah.
The arrival syndrome is a fun one.
Yeah. So we'll take probably a little bit more time to go through the arrival syndrome. But again, thank you for your time. I look forward to our next podcast, and we'll attack the arrival syndrome.
Great. Thank you, Wade.
Yeah, thanks so much. If you're enjoying this podcast or know anyone else that might be interested, please be sure to hit the subscribe button and please leave a review. This will help this podcast reach and help more people by ranking higher in searches and ultimately help more people get out of financial bondage. And don't be afraid to share this podcast with your friends and family, as we can be easily found on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.